know Krista Seitz, our programs manager, and we had a little technical difficulties here. But good evening. It's a real pleasure to have all of you here tonight for the Dan Schnur Political Report. Really appreciate you joining us tonight. I'm Dr. Richard Downey, the President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. And let me begin by saying first that on behalf of all of us at the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, our hearts go out to all of you and all of those who have been affected by the fires that have been just raging through Los Angeles. It's a terrible, catastrophic situation. There's been so much loss, lives lost, thousands of homes, properties, thousands of people evacuated, waiting to go back to their homes. It's just a heartbreaking situation, and I hope that all of you are right now safe and okay. But at the national level, where we're going to focus tonight, and international level, I'd like to highlight a few challenges that are going to be facing President-elect Trump when he's inaugurated here about 4 days from now, because the world that he faces when he's inaugurated will be a very different state of the world that he faced 8 years ago when he took office for the first time. And for example, just to highlight a couple of examples, he'll be facing the axis of upheaval, which is what's the term for the coalition of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. These are all countries that are uniting to try and minimize the leadership and of the United States and impact the rules-based international system that the United States worked decades to put into effect. The war in Ukraine next month will be in its 3rd anniversary. We'll see how President Trump responds to that. I'm sure Dan will be talking about that a little bit. China, we are in a competition with China across all domains: political, economic, military, technological. Iran is as close as possible to developing its own nuclear weapon. North Korea is fighting in Ukraine, assisting the Russians, sending our ammunition and now soldiers as well. Israel and Gaza, we heard last night, of course, that there may be a ceasefire. We'll see how this works out. There's both sides. It's inconclusive right now, so we'll see where that goes. But Israel is still locked in conflict with many of Iran's proxies. And in Sudan, there's a humanitarian disaster that has displaced more people than the wars in Ukraine and Gaza combined. So there's a lot going on facing the president-elect, and there's a lot facing him right in our country alone with what's going on. And I know Dan will be talking about that. I'd like to say that you can be part of this conversation tonight. Dan will be talking for about 30 minutes, but then we open it up to your questions. And at any time during this session, you can go to the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. And Madison Alt, our communications manager, will take a look at your question and ask those questions at when the time comes during the Q&A portion of this session. Now, if your questions aren't answered, there's a members only session afterwards where Dan will answer your questions. So that's a great benefit to being a member. And if you're not a member, please join. It helps us tremendously. And we know many of you are not here in the Southern California area. You're from all around the United States. We're delighted to have you join our audience. We'd also be even more happy if you joined the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. You don't have to be in Los Angeles. You can be from anywhere. I do want to thank all of you who have donated in the past. We we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan nonprofit, and we live and die based on your contributions. And so we really appreciate those of you who have donated. And if any one of you who are in a position to be able to donate, I hope you appreciate what we do with programs like the Dan Schnur Political Report, because what we're trying to offer are nonpartisan conversations on critical, crucial issues that allow you to hear all sides and make up your own minds and be informed about what's really going on, rather than hearing a polarized position. So if that's important to you, please donate generously. We really appreciate it. Again, those of you who have donated already, thank you so much. We look forward to anything you would be willing to do, and it's easy to do. There's a QR code in the chat box where you can go to our website, lawacth.org, and you'll find the donate button. You can go on there to donate. We would certainly appreciate it. Now, I know you're all anxious to get to Dan. I always appreciate his analysis as much or more than you do. So with that, let me turn it over to Dan to start this session. Dan, please take it away.
Rich, thanks so much for that kind introduction and that overview for all of us. And thanks to all of you, as you do every month, for joining us for these conversations. As Rich mentioned, I'll take about half of our remaining time to go over a few topics with you. But then, as our regular audience members know, my favorite part of the program is when I stop talking and Maddie begins to forward some of the questions and comments and insights that all of you have. And so I'll be very eager to hear those. Now, when we first scheduled the timing for this January program, our first program of 2025, and by the way, that means we're coming up on our 5-year anniversary of this webinar, if you can believe it. We originally scheduled this for today, Thursday, January 16th, because it was only 4 days before a presidential inauguration. And we knew, of course, that the country's attention would be focused on the upcoming transition between the outgoing President Joe Biden and the incoming President Donald Trump. But as so often happens, and we've learned over almost 5 years with this webinar, there's no way to anticipate it. But as so often happens, other news frequently gets in the way. As Rich mentioned earlier, and as most of you know, of course, it appears there may be a ceasefire in Gaza, and we'll talk more about that later, particularly for those of you who have questions about the Middle East and what may or may not be happening there in the closing days of Joe Biden's presidency. Of course, this week we saw the beginning of the confirmation hearings in the Senate for Trump's cabinet members, and we can talk about those as well. But by far, the biggest story of the week, no question, are the LA wildfires in Pacific Palisades in my old neighborhood, and Altadena, and elsewhere throughout the Southland. And the most important part of this story, of course, is the human suffering that's taken place. And as Rich mentioned, our hearts go out to those who are going through such difficult struggles. And I know that all of you, like us and our family, those of us who've been fortunate enough to avoid the damage, are doing everything we can to try to help others who are in need. But in addition to the on-the-ground crisis, in addition to the critical policy questions that are upcoming about safety and rebuilding and fireproofing in the future, but there's also plenty of politics here too. Mayor Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles, is taking the worst of this, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But the most heated debate right now is taking place on a cross-country basis between California's Democratic leadership and Republican-controlled Washington, D.C., most notably between California's Governor Gavin Newsom and President-elect Donald Trump. Newsom and Trump have never liked each other. They've exchanged some very harsh criticisms of each other over the years. But now, even in the middle of this extraordinary natural disaster, we're seeing the two of them and their supporters in their respective parties on the respective ends of the country involved in a very harsh and increasingly nasty political debate. And Maddie, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but to me, it's just fascinating to watch because as we see the coverage on our screens, either old-fashioned TV or on our computer screens, on one hand, you see the real world suffering. On the other is this political debate taking place concurrently. And it's a little bit surreal, don't you think?
It really is. Sorry about that. I couldn't unmute myself for a second there. It's particularly surreal for me because I, up until about 2.5 years ago, was an East Coaster. So this is my first time experiencing an LA wildfire as an Angelino. And I will say one of my big questions just off the bat is how unusual is this argument between Trump and Newsom during a natural disaster? Because this feels really out there for me.
Well, it's a great question, and it's a reasonable question to ask because, look, as much as we would like it for our politicians to be able to put aside politics at a time of disaster like this, well, the post-partisan divisions don't go away. Republicans and Democrats, now in a Trump era, but throughout most of our nation's history, have had deep-seated ideological differences, and those don't go away, even during a time of crisis like this. It used to be said, back in the 20th century, it used to be said that politics stops at the water's edge. In other words, that when our nation faced an international crisis, that the leaders of both of our parties would put aside their partisan differences in order to unite to take on that international challenge. That's no longer the case. And the idea of our leaders putting aside their differences, even temporarily, once again, sounds like something out of the past as opposed to in the present. As I said, Democratic and Republican leaders have always fought about these matters. But the difference is they usually wait until the crisis itself on the ground has passed. And you have Trump threatening to withhold federal aid money because of disagreements with Newsom. You have Newsom calling for an investigation of local and regional authorities here in Los Angeles as it relates to water supply and preparation. So the politics isn't anything unusual, Maddie. The fact that it's gotten so intense and so harsh and so nasty, even while the real world crisis is still happening, that's somewhat more unusual. And I do want to, before we go on to our first poll question, and we can certainly come back to Trump and Newsom a little bit later if our audience likes and has questions. In particular, the idea that the Republican-controlled Congress is now thinking about attaching unrelated policy questions to the California aid package. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but right now, at least for a couple minutes, I want to get back to local politics. I mentioned briefly that Mayor Karen Bass is coming under some very strident criticism from any number of sources, including some traditional allies who do not feel that she has been effective in her leadership during the current fires. Now, of course, Mayor Bass, as all of you know, was out of the country. She was in the country of Ghana, representing the U.S. at the inauguration of that country's leader when the fires broke out. And she came back to Los Angeles the next day. But both the fact that she was out of town when the fires erupted, despite some forecasts of very difficult fire activity coming, and the fact that many observers feel that she has not been the type of strong presence that many citizens look there from their leaders during a time of crisis, is she has faced a lot of somewhat unfriendly fire. And so, Krista, if I can ask you to put up the first question for our group. As Rich mentioned, we're from all over the country, but I know our core audience is in Southern California. But even for those of you from other parts of the state or other parts of the country, we'd be interested in your opinion here. So simply put, is it fair or unfair to criticize Mayor Bass for her absence, for being out of the country when the fires erupted? And we can talk separately about the city's preparation. To me, that's a separate but related question. But just on the very specific idea, one, is this fair criticism? She's the mayor of Los Angeles. She should be here, particularly if a crisis of this magnitude is expected. Number two, it's unfair. She's the mayor of Los Angeles, but she represents our city around the country and around the world. And there's no way to completely avoid these kind of challenges. Those of you with long memories may remember that then Mayor Jim Hahn was on the East Coast on September 11, 2001, and a young city council member, 26-year-old Alex Padilla, became acting mayor during that crisis. And of course, she's now our senior United States Senator. So is the criticism of Karen Bass for being out of the country at the time of this crisis, is it fair or is it not? Well, look at those answers. Very interesting. 35% of you, more than a third, say that it is fair criticism. 55%, slightly more than half, say it is unfair. And as time passes, again, I suspect this question will be conflated with other relevant questions of funding the fire department, of whether the reservoirs and the hydrants were in working condition, whose responsibility those things are. So I think we'll be examining these questions, not just this year, but next year. Remember when Karen Bass is up for re-election. And one of her strongest critics over the last several days has been Rick Caruso, who of course lost to her in last year's mayoral campaign and seems to be making noises about running again. But we'll come back to this a little bit. We'll come back to this a little bit later. But Maddie, before we move back to our national discussion, is there anything in particular that strikes you about this more local debate?
Honestly, given how passionate the conversation I've seen around, who's to blame, I didn't expect our poll results to be so close. But I am sort of wondering what you think. Do you think it's fair to criticize or not criticize about the absence? I mean, really, like you said, it was a lot closer than I expected, and there are still jobs that come with being mayor that require you to be out of the city. So I'm wondering what you think about that before we move on to a little more global.
Well, as you know, Maddie, I generally am pretty much in agreement with our regular participants. We have a pretty smart and politically savvy group that we join. But every once in a while, I'll disagree with them. And while I don't think it's grounds certainly to recall Karen Bass from office, as some of our critics have suggested, and I think there's other issues that should be much more relevant when she runs for re-election next year, I do think it was an error in judgment. And this is not to criticize her mayorship more broadly, but I do believe it was an error in judgment, particularly given the forecasts that were coming in the preceding weekend about a heavy fire event. And she is certainly entitled and expected to travel nationally and internationally. It would be foolish for her to forego those. But when the city is predicted to face a challenge like this one, even if we didn't know quite how great the scope, with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, I think I would have said, let's play it safe here. And maybe a member of the city council or another representative can represent us in Ghana. So again, it's not the kind of thing that should define her term in office. But I do think, and I suspect that the mayor and the people around her would like to have this one over. In retrospect, it probably would have made more sense for her to err on the side of caution. But now, let's move to the national discussion, because as I said earlier, that's why we scheduled for tonight, just 4 days away from a presidential inauguration. And let's go to what we plan to talk about today, the fact that Joe Biden will be leaving office on Monday when Donald Trump is sworn in as our next president. Now, Trump, of course, is the first president since Grover Cleveland in the late 19th century to serve 2 non-consecutive terms as president. And Trump, I believe, armed with the confidence that he developed over his first term in office, is already moving very aggressively on many issues, foreign and domestic, even before taking office. We mentioned earlier the possible ceasefire in Gaza. Well, Trump and his representatives have been very engaged in those negotiations. And it's been commonly noted, including by senior members of the Biden administration, that Biden and Trump's team together, in fact, may have been necessary to pull off the ceasefire if actually it happens. So Trump isn't waiting to be sworn in as president to already take a very assertive role. Even if he doesn't, officially hold the job. And we'll talk in just a minute about how Trump has already gotten started in advance of being sworn in his office. But before we do, more on Donald Trump in a minute, and my guesses for our webinars going forward. But first, let's talk about Joe Biden, the outgoing president, for just a bit. And Krista, if I can ask you to put up our second poll question for the audience, we're going to ask you pretty straightforward. Looking back at almost precisely 4 years, what grade would you give Biden for his presidency? A through F. And we don't grade on a curve here. We grade on, we grade on merit, and we grade on results. And whether you happen to be a Democrat, Republican, or an independent, I want you to give, and of course this is anonymous, I want you to give your honest appraisal of the Biden presidency. And we'll talk about that for a couple of minutes before we pivot to the future. So, Krista, what did we get from our group? What are they saying? Oh, very interesting. Now, as we've talked about before, our membership or our viewers tend to lean somewhat leftward, as we've learned on various questions that we've asked during last year's presidential campaign. So here, even from a group that does tend to lean somewhat leftward, 12% give Joe Biden an A for his time in office. 54%, slightly more than half, give him a good solid B. And if you add that up, A, B together, that's almost 2/3 of our respondents. We have 26%, a solid quarter of our group, who give him a C, passing grade, but not much more than that. And 8% who give him a D or an F, 4% on each. So all in all, Joe Biden gets good marks from our group. And hopefully one of the things we can address when we move to your questions going forward is to look back at maybe some of the greatest successes, but also perhaps some of the greatest shortcomings of Biden's presidency. And what I suspect in particular will dominate Biden's legacy, fairly or not, is his decision and the timing of his decision not to seek re-election. There's no question he accomplished a great deal, an immense amount, substantively, over the course of his 4 years in office. Whether you happen to agree with the Biden agenda or not, he accomplished an immense amount, particularly with a very closely divided Congress. But at least right now, it appears that many of those achievements will be overshadowed by the nature of how his presidency ended. And as time passes, what we've seen over the years is that when presidents leave office with middling public approval ratings, and as I think all of you know, the American public as a whole does not hold Joe Biden in nearly as high regard as our poll respondents did. He's getting a approval rating right now, a favorability rating in the high 30s, just under 40%. But other presidents over the years, at least through modern history, who've left office without a great deal of public support, and I think about George H.W. Bush, I think about Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, even while they left office, voters did not think particularly highly of how they had performed in office. As the years passed and voters were able to look back from a broader perspective, we've seen for those presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, Bush, and others, we've seen their approval ratings raise. So as time passes, we'll see whether the same thing happens with Joe Biden or not. Now to turn to Trump. Of course, as I said, he's off to a very fast start. He has representatives in the Middle East and has been talking, he himself has been talking to Netanyahu. And while Biden is as well, Trump is not being particularly shy about taking credit for this ceasefire. He's already been moving on Ukraine, and his nominee for National Security Advisor has now made it clear that perhaps ending the war on day one, as candidate Trump had indicated he would, is probably not entirely realistic. And they are now talking about this as roughly a 100-day effort. But Trump and his team have already, in all evidence, been involved in some fairly heated conversation with both Russia and Ukraine about the path forward, in coordination, I should say, in coordination for the most part with the Biden administration. They've been talking about the border. They've been talking about taxes, most notably about tariffs, about energy, about the ban on the social media platform TikTok, which is supposed to take place this Sunday, and Trump has already indicated he would like to see that ban put off to see if he can work out some type of agreement on it. And then, aside from traditional foreign policy issues, as you all know, the president-elect has been talking about buying the the island of Greenland. He's been talking about reclaiming the Panama Canal from Panama after the United States gave it back to Panama in the 1970s, and has talked, perhaps in jest, perhaps not, about why and how Canada should become our 51st state. So all sorts of things going on in Trump land. And I guess before we go any further, Krista, let's put up the third question and see what our group finds to be the most interesting set of issues at the beginning of the Trump administration. So which issue will you be watching most closely as Trump takes office? Will it be economic issues, whether inflation or taxes or other economic policy? Will it be immigration and border related issues? And it's been reported that Trump is preparing literally dozens of executive orders that he will issue on Monday afternoon on that front. Energy and climate issues. We're already seeing the incoming Trump administration looking to very aggressively reverse a lot of the steps that Biden and his team have taken on climate issues over the last 4 years. Abortion policy and healthcare. We heard Trump during the campaign make a very significant effort, and to some degree successful, to downplay his opposition to abortion, to talk about this as a state's issue. But no question that abortion and healthcare, particularly the future of the Affordable Care Act, are all going to be part of an ongoing debate starting or continuing on January 20th. And then finally, big fifth issue, foreign policy covering the rest of the world: Ukraine, the Middle East, China and Taiwan, Iran, North Korea, all sorts of different aspects of a foreign policy discussion. But what are you going to be watching the most closely as this transition occurs? Let's see what we got here. Look at these results. 38%, and of course, LA World Affairs Council Town Hall's heritage is as an international affairs organization. So perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that 38%, more than a third, have picked foreign policy as the area that they're going to be watching most closely. And Maddie, it's too bad we aren't able to put up more than 5 questions. Maybe next month we can ask people which foreign policy issue they'll be watching most: Middle East or Ukraine or Taiwan, or Greenland or Panama Canal or Canada. So we'll dig into that a little bit more next month. 30%. For those of you who picked domestic policy, 30%, almost a third of our overall group, and almost exactly half of those who selected a domestic policy issue, have said economy. And once again, what we might have to do is break this down next month to find out what's of most interesting and important to you. Is inflation going to begin to rise again, as recent indicators have demonstrated? Will the fight over the tax cuts and extending the Trump tax bill from 2017 catch your attention? Or this broader debate over tariffs, which is an international issue, but with very strong economic domestic overtones? 21%, not that much less than the economy. 21% believe immigration and border. And I will say, regardless of how you rank those issues, that one will probably take center stage most quickly, just because a lot of what Trump wants to do can be accomplished, at least temporarily, through executive order rather than legislation. And there's still a fight going on in Congress among Republicans about whether to separate out border and defense policy from the economic and tax debate, and to move forward on border issues first in Congress as well. Energy and climate, abortion and healthcare, certainly very dramatic shifts from what the Biden administration has attempted to accomplish during the president's time, during the president's 4 years in office, but probably not as much quite as immediately, or I should say quite as visibly. Because frankly, I'd be very surprised if a week from today, we haven't already seen the Trump administration take significant action on both the climate and on the healthcare front, again through executive order. And even though legislation will move more slowly on these issues, make no mistake about it, both issues are part of the Trump agenda. But a very, very interesting set of questions or set of issues. And as always, it's interesting for me. It's fascinating for me to watch what our group has to say.
I couldn't agree more. And I do have to say, given those poll results, shameless plug, we have an event the first week of February with we have a webinar that's all about the economic impacts of Trump's incoming administration. So please join us for that. But with that being said, Dan, I do have to know, what issue are you going to be watching the most? I mean, like I said, our poll results were pretty skewed there. So I'm curious to see what your concern for the biggest topic is going to be in the upcoming days.
Well, as many of you know, having watched this before, I've spent a lot of time over the years working on issues relating to Israel and the Middle East. And even if there wasn't a potential ceasefire in Gaza under consideration right now, I do spend an extraordinary amount of time paying attention to that part of the world. But given at least the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility of a ceasefire, and given, interesting to me, the strength of Trump's relationships with both Netanyahu and with the Saudi Arabian leadership, I feel that the Trump administration in the Middle East, even once the Gaza war is settled, I suspect that the Abraham Accords, which were accomplished before Trump left office the first time, and fostered under Biden, of course, I think you're going to see a very considered effort from the Trump White House and the Trump State Department under Secretary of State Rubio to try to expand the Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia in a way that would fundamentally remake the Middle East. This is a topic that could take up an entire hour of our program, but if you look at how weakened Iran is, given this, the losses that Hamas has suffered, that Hezbollah has suffered, and that Iran itself has suffered at the hands of the Israelis over the last few months. The combination of a potential settlement in the Gaza war, given the weakening, the exposure of the weakness of Iran, and given the increasing hunger on the part of Saudi Arabia to assert a broader role in the Middle East, to me, that may be the most important issue for me to watch in the future, in the immediate future. But of course, as we all know, the Middle East and Ukraine and Russia, as important as they are, the most important issue and international challenge our country faces now, and as outgoing Secretary of State Blinken has suggested, the most important foreign policy challenge he believes that the United States has faced since the end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union in the late 1980s is our multifaceted competition with China. That too is another conversation to have. And watching to see how Trump and Xi approach each other during Trump's new term in office on issues relating to Taiwan, to trade, to tariffs, and to TikTok is going to be fascinating. So that's a really, really long way of saying I'll be paying closest attention to the Middle East, just like the rest of our group. And I'll be eager to talk about each of these issues with you, with all of you, in future months. But I think our group on domestic policy, the key phrase of the question was, which issue we'll be watching most closely as Trump takes office? While I believe that economic issues, particularly inflation, particularly tariffs, are going to be of great interest, of course, over the next 4 years. In the short run, as Trump takes office, that debate over border policy is going to be very visible and very visceral. And watching the way the Democrats are already moving to the center on border-related issues is very, very instructive. And so the border over the long haul may or may not be the most important policy issue that our country faces. It's a critically important one, but whether it's most or not is another conversation. But at least for me right now, more than Gaza, more than China, more than the economy, more than abortion rights, the debate over border immigration, in addition to its policy significance, tells us an immense amount about the dramatically changing politics in this country. We saw in this last election how working class voters, voters without a college education, of all races and ethnicities, not just white voters, but Black and Latino voters as well, moved toward Trump. And border policy was one of the major reasons for that shift. And we're already, as I mentioned a minute or two ago, we're already seeing the Democratic Party, while it's still figuring out its approach on other issues, on the first pieces of immigration and border-related legislation that Republicans are bringing up in Congress, large numbers of Democrats are voting for more restrictive solutions. The Lake and Riley Act, which would require the deportation of undocumented immigrants accused of nonviolent crimes, theft and others, received more than 30 Democratic votes in the United States Senate. And just today, Representative Nancy Mace of South Carolina introduced a bill that would require the deportation of undocumented immigrants who committed sexual assault. More than 60 House Democrats voted for the bill. So we're seeing the Dems move to the center on border-related policy. And as the Democrats figure out their path forward in a Trump era, that issue might give us a greater clue than any other. So the logical question is, how should the Democrats respond to Trump? And we can talk about that with our group in just a minute. But at least on one issue, border and immigration policy, they've decided, large numbers of Democrats, not to fight Trump, but to look for ways to cooperate with him. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask Krista to put up two questions, not simultaneously, but one just right after the other. And so we're going to ask each of you, given the range of policy challenges that Congress and the president and the country face, we're going to ask you how the Democrats should position themselves. Krista, can we put up that next question? Okay. So here's the question. What issue should the Democrats fight Trump on? Some of you might think all of them. Some of you think Democrats should fight Trump on every front, just like they did in 2017. Others of you, though, might think that might make more sense to look for at least areas of cooperation. So since you only get one choice, even if you think the Democrats ought to fight Trump on all 5 of these issues, or on all 4 of these issues, which one do you think they should fight hardest? Let's see what we get. Hey, here we go. Well, we have a fairly divided group here. 39% say that the Democrats should really dig in and fight on the economy, on inflation and taxes. But 27%, not that much less, believe that the strongest pushback should be on abortion and healthcare. And there's no question that that's the issue area where Democrats do enjoy still the greatest level of public support. 18% on foreign policy, and slightly smaller numbers on immigration, as we were talking about earlier. But it is instructive that it seems, at least, Maddie, like most of our respondents agree with the Democrats' decision not to give in to Trump totally on immigration and border issues. But it's the one where they seem least eager to cast a fight. And so, Krista, let's put up our next question. We're going to flip this around on all of you. We've asked you what issue the Democrats should fight hardest on. And this might be self-evident given our past answers, but the answers you just gave, but we want to see what you have to say anyway. What issue do you think the Democrats should look for agreement with Trump on most aggressively? And I wonder if our group says border, given an immigration issues, given what we saw on the last question. But just out of curiosity, even for those of you who want to see Democrats fight back and fight back hard, are any of these issues an issue where you see potential for cooperation? Or do you think none of the above? No, the Democrats should not try to work with Trump on any of these issues. Let's see what we got. First of all, 13%, which is not a particularly high number, 13%, about 1 out of 8 of our group, says that nope, Democrats should not try to work with Trump on anything. 36%, which is sort of the bookend of what we saw in the last poll question, believe immigration and border issues. But what's interesting to me in this one is 28%, a pretty sizable number, do want to see politics stop at the water's edge and do want Democrats to look for ways to work with Trump on Ukraine and the Middle East and other foreign policy issues. But at least right now, this represents the biggest unresolved fight among Democrats. In 2017, the entire party were unified. They wanted to fight Trump every step of the way. But now we're seeing a real split between the centrists in the party, people like Pete Buttigieg. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer gave a speech today in which she talked about working with Trump on issues like trade and like manufacturing policy and pushing back at him on issues like abortion rights and other social issues. So you have centrists like Buttigieg and Whitmer. Then you have more progressive Democrats like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who really want to keep up the fight. And I feel like this is going to be the biggest challenge over the next 2 years for the Democratic congressional leaders, Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, the ranking Democrats in the House and Senate respectively. They've divided caucuses on almost all of these issues, and how they steer their caucuses forward, even in the minority, given the fact that Republicans hold such a tiny majority, I think more than is going to almost more than anything define the outcomes of the 2026 midterm elections. So I think I went a little bit long here, Maddie, because there was a lot to cover. But what do you say with our last 15, 20 minutes or so, we get in as many questions from our group as we can?
I think we should, because we do have a lot of questions and I cannot wait to hear your answer with a lot of them. So are you ready to just dive right in?
Absolutely, I am ready.
All right. Now, this one, I am picking this first because of my own biases. I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Do you think that any of Trump's cabinet picks will fail to get confirmed? I've been watching a lot of the recordings coming out of that, and I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, I think the important thing to remember is that Republicans do have a majority in the Senate. And while there are there's a handful of Republican senators who are somewhat suspicious of Trump. There are a lot of others who either on the natural are very strong supporters of his, or less naturally likely to support him, but recognize the strong backing he has in their states, are reluctant to buck him. So all of you, anybody who's tuning into a webinar like this, already knows the math. There's 53 Republican senators, which means if 4 senators vote against any nominee, then that nominee probably won't succeed. There was a lot of speculation that Pete Hegseth, the Fox News commentator, who is Trump's nominee for Secretary of Defense, would lose at least 4 votes. I don't predict, but the general consensus seems to be that after his first confirmation hearing earlier this week, Hegseth is probably in a pretty strong position. But I wouldn't give him that job yet, because you start out with 2 Republicans who are very skeptical of Trump, Susan Collins from Maine and Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. They won't vote against all Trump nominees, but they're the Republican members who are most likely to vote against him. The other person to keep an eye on is Mitch McConnell, the former Republican Senate leader. And it was very widely known how little McConnell and Trump thought of each other when McConnell was leader. But as leader, McConnell felt the obligation to try to work with Trump as leaders in the same political party. McConnell's not a part of leadership anymore. He's retired from that position. And so to me, one of the most interesting things to watch in Washington over the next few years, not just with Trump nominees, but more broadly, is we're about to find out what Mitch McConnell really thinks of Donald Trump. We know he doesn't like him, but now that he's in a position to act on that dislike, we'll see where he votes against. And even if Hegseth is confirmed, the nominee that McConnell is known to be most concerned about is Tulsi Gabbard, who would be the head of national intelligence in this country if she were confirmed. And so I think at this point, of the various nominees, more than Hegseth, more than Robert Kennedy, I think if any were not to be confirmed, Gabbard, I think, is the one who is most endangered. Because if Collins and Murkowski and McConnell all voted against her, it would only take one other vote. And John Curtis, the new senator from Utah, is known to be somewhat skeptical of some of Trump's nominees. Other more traditional Republicans, Tom Tillis from North Carolina, Todd Young from Indiana, Bill Cassidy from Louisiana. There's probably 7 or 8 other Republicans who would not be automatic yes votes. And if just one of them were to vote against Gabbard, then with the other 3, she is defeated and Trump would have to find another nominee. I don't quite have the courage to predict that Gabbard will be defeated, nor do I have the courage to predict she would be the only one who is. What I'll simply say is I think she would be the most likely not to be confirmed. Although as these hearings take place, as we learned in the past, all sorts of surprises can arise. So I'd say Gabbard is the one to watch, but there's a broader set of challenges here than the arithmetic would suggest.
All right. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And I am unfortunately going to ask you to make another prediction. I'm sorry, I know that part's tough, but this question is asking, what do you anticipate Trump's first day in office executive orders will be and other non-executive orders actions? What do you think the direction he's going to go in is for his first day?
Well, his advisors have made it pretty clear that border security and immigration policy will not be the sole focus of his first day in office, but will be a primary focus. So I think we'll see a great deal on that front. Now, if you kept track, one of Trump's favorite rhetorical devices on the campaign trail was to say, on day 1 as president, I will. And along with ending the war in Ukraine, along with closing the border, along with cutting gasoline and energy prices, there were literally dozens and dozens of other promises that Trump made over the course of his campaign that he would accomplish on day 1. Let's assume that some of that is rhetorical overkill, so not all of it is literally going to happen in his first 12 hours in office. But again, while I don't think he'll be limited to border and immigration policy, I think that's where you'll see the most visible effort. And then once we move past the first day, Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Majority Leader John Thune have made it clear that they believe that passing the Riley Act on undocumented nonviolent criminals and the Nancy Mace bill on sexual offenders who are undocumented, they would like to see those as the first pieces of legislation that Trump signs after they pass Congress. So even though the other issues we discussed earlier are going to be front and center, I suspect the border debate will be the most visible right at the outset, both in terms of executive orders and legislation.
I'm glad that that's the direction you went in because it does lead into our next question, which is talking about the immigration bill that you already discussed. It's saying that, a migrant who's been accused of theft could be deported. And this question is asking, what would prevent someone from filing a false accusation of theft to get someone deported? And why wouldn't there be a requirement to be a conviction and not necessarily just an accusation?
Well, it's likely that the reason that so many Democrats in the Senate voted for the Riley Act, not to pass, but to continue debate on it, because as all of you know, the filibuster requires 60 votes to be broken. Otherwise, 40 United States senators can't stop a bill from progressing. So it's important to note that the 35 plus 37, 38 Democratic senators who voted for the Riley bill are not voting for its passage. They're simply voting to keep the conversation going and to keep it from being filibustered. And while several of those members voted for the bill because they do believe that an undocumented individual who commits a nonviolent crime should be deported, many of the Democratic senators who voted for it did so not because they supported the bill as it stands, but they want to move it forward so they can debate just those questions. In other words, should there be a conviction required? Should there be a separate sort of prejudicial decision made? Or, like you asked, Maddie, is it enough not just for a citizen to make a claim against another citizen, but for more formal charges to be filed? So it's not as if an individual doesn't like their next door neighbor, they could file charges and have them deported, goes at least one potential alternative to the current bill, but rather it would require action taken by a governing authority. But many of the bill's opponents believe, as it's currently written, a neighbor could certainly level charges against another and force this forward. So I will predict there will be something called the Lake and Riley Act signed into law very early in Donald Trump's term in office. Exactly what the parameters are for what would trigger that deportation. Charges by whom, conviction. There's still a lot of debate to be had on that front, on that more specific front.
Certainly. Thank you so much. And keeping with the topic of immigration and the border, this question is asking, do you see mass deportations actually being carried out within the first few months of Trump's administration?
Well, this is one of the most important, one of the largest unanswered questions about Trump's incoming administration. Because at many times over the course of the campaign, candidate Trump talked about mass deportations of millions and millions, more than 10 million undocumented immigrants. But we've also heard some of his advisors, most notably Tom Homan, who's going to be his chief advisor on border policy, has talked about prioritizing undocumented migrants who have committed violent crimes. So we don't know. And the politics of this are very different. We saw polling just before the election that showed that more than half, between 55 and 60% of Americans, did believe that undocumented immigrants should be deported. But when the question was broken down more specifically, what we found is that the majority of those respondents wanted to see undocumented migrants who had committed violent crimes deported, but not all undocumented. So if Trump were to pursue that broader policy of trying to move every single undocumented in the country out of the country, aside from the extraordinary and unprecedented financial and logistical challenges, he probably wouldn't enjoy majority of public support. If he does decide and instructs Homan and the rest of his team to narrow their focus to those who'd committed violent crimes, then I suspect that President Trump would enjoy very strong public support. On the other hand, the broader approach will motivate the Trump base to a much greater degree. We just don't know yet. And there are people, as we know, in the incoming administration, the incoming White House, whispering in both of his ears on this. Some people saying, go big, go broad, fulfill the promise to deport all undocumented immigrants. And others saying, not just logistically and financially, but philosophically, let's concentrate on those who have committed violent crimes. Like I said, it's probably one of the most important unanswered questions that we're going to be waiting for answers on in the days and weeks ahead.
Thank you. And I do want to keep talking about Trump, but we're going to shift overseas. This question is asking, how is Trump going to address the war in Ukraine? Do you think he'll continue the Biden doctrine towards Ukraine or not?
Well, Trump, of course, has been very, very critical, as all of you know, of the Biden administration's approach to Ukraine. And as I said earlier, Trump had promised to end the war on day one, although his national security team is making it clear that 100 days might be more realistic. The widespread concern in Europe and among Ukraine's strongest supporters in this country is that Trump is going to force Ukraine to settle for a peace that allows Russia to maintain control over large portions of that country. And right now, Russia holds roughly 20% of the landmass of Ukraine. But what's been interesting over the months is as Trump has been talking about forcing a peace, And as Ukraine's defenders have worried about him requiring Ukraine to allow Russia to keep some of that land, an increasing number of Ukraine's strongest defenders have come to the unpleasant conclusion that there's no way for Ukraine to get a lot of that land back. And even while in a more ideal world that would be the case, given the length of the war and the tremendous attrition, the extraordinary losses that Ukraine has faced, not just in terms of land, but in terms of soldiers, that wanting to maintain the entire country or reclaim the entire country is simply not realistic. So oddly enough, Ukraine's strongest defenders, both in the United States and in Europe, are actually probably a little bit closer to the Trump position than they were several months ago. I saw a startling quote just yesterday talking about the future prospect for peace talks. And an observer said, Ukraine isn't running out of weaponry. Ukraine is running out of Ukrainians. There's only a certain number of people who can continue to fight this fight, given the immense population advantage that Russia maintains over Ukraine. And so a Trump-forced settlement that does allow Russia to keep a portion of that country is looking more and more likely, because the alternatives are just simply, unfortunately, in my opinion, looking less and less realistic.
Thank you, Dan. Now, this question is sort of asking you to have that 2020 hindsight that we talked about. It's asking, if the Democratic Party had picked a different candidate early on and asked Joe to step aside, do you think the outcome of the election might have been different? I know this is something we've talked about in webinars, but given that the times are continuing to change, I'm wondering if your opinion on that question has changed, and if you do think that we might have had a different outcome if we'd had a different candidate.
Well, I will say, if anything, my opinion on that has strengthened since the election, since November. Back then, and you're right, we talked about it here, a lot of Democrats blame Biden not just for his decision, but his timing of it, waiting until 107 days before the election, as opposed to deciding a year ago or even a few months earlier to step down. And I think there's some validity to that criticism. If Biden had announced a year before the election, in November or December of 2023, that he was not going to seek re-election, the Democrats would have had a full primary process, and they would have selected a nominee, probably someone other than Vice President Harris. But to be fair to the vice president, a set of primary contests is excellent testing grounds for candidates. Candidates gain experience and gain confidence in those primaries. And she, in fact, may have emerged as a much stronger candidate after several months of primaries than she was able to do in just barely a few months. But I think whether the nominee had been Harris or another prominent Democrat, it would have been that larger window of opportunity would have given that Democratic nominee an advantage that Harris simply lacked. And as we've talked about before, getting to know the American people, and more importantly, getting the American people to know you in 107 days is a very, very difficult challenge. And a Democratic nominee, whether Harris or Newsom or Whitmer or Buttigieg or Warner or anybody else, I think having been given a full year rather than just a few months would have had a much better opportunity. That doesn't guarantee a Democratic victory, but I think it increases the likelihood of a Democrat beating Trump. That makes that likelihood much, much greater.
Certainly. Do you think we've got time for one more?
I think we do.
Okay, a little bit of a hard hitter here, so we're going to end on this.
Embraced.
If we had term limits, would Congress pay more attention to what the country needs rather than their own election, in your opinion?
Well, I will admit that I was a very strong supporter of term limits when they were first instituted for the California state legislature way back in the 1990s. And I think they bring all sorts of benefits. And I was proud to be part of the effort, is we reformed the original term limits law about a decade ago. And instead of, in the California state legislature, instead of members being limited to 3 2-year terms or 6 years in the state assembly and 2 4-year terms or 8 years in the state senate, what we did is we combined the two and said a member can serve for a total of 12 years in any combination of the two chambers, which created a much greater level of continuity. And to me, the greatest downside of term limits is it does rob a body of experience. And so now, instead of people having to hop from the Assembly and the Senate and back, they can serve for a longer period of time. But what I will say, even though term limits robs a legislative body or would rob Congress of some experience, what I like most about California's term limits is it's to the degree to which it's increased the diversity of voices and perspectives and experiences in the state capitol. We have some people who'd worked in politics who worked as legislative staff, but we have people who've worked in private business and teachers and nurses and doctors and other professionals who bring a different type of experience to the Capitol. And we see a much broader range of diversity demographically as well. More female legislators than had been the case before term limits. More legislators from underrepresented minority communities than we'd ever seen. The turnover brings in a wide range of voices. If I ran the zoo, if I had a magic wand, I might institute term limits for one chamber and not the other in Washington, D.C. That way you get the benefit of experience on one side of the aisle or on one side of the Capitol, and you get the churn and the new perspectives and new voices on the other. But getting 435 members of the House and 100 senators to vote to limit their own terms, let's call that one a long shot. So while it's a fascinating conversation, let's agree it's a pretty hypothetical one.
All right. Okay. Final question, I promise. Dan, when are you running for president? We have to know.
I have way too much fun with these conversations. So I'm very happy with where I am, and I'm lucky to get to work with all of you. And I'm very, very lucky that we have such an engaged and intelligent audience to work with every month. Why would I want to go anywhere?
That's a good point. We can't complain. We're happy to keep you right here.
You know, Dan, let me second that. We're all very happy that you are happy doing this because we all really enjoy it. You know, I just want to say, because of the fires, there's a lot of anxiety in people. You know, with the Trump administration on the cusp of being inaugurated, there's a lot of anxiety and anxiousness. And I know I speak for many of our audience, if not most, that it's very comforting for you to walk us through all of these possibilities of what's going to happen. And it's a very helpful, calming, and very much appreciated insights that you offer. So in particular, I think this has been a great session, and I'm glad you enjoyed it too. You know, I do want to, so thank you very much, Dan, as always. I want to thank our Madison Alt, our communications manager, for managing the questions today, and Krista Seitz, who you saw briefly helping me with my technical problem earlier, who managed the back part of this, for doing that. I also want to thank all of you in the audience. Great questions today, very, very helpful, very useful to get at the heart of what we're about to experience with a new president here in 4 days. So thank you all for that. I also, one last time, I want to thank you for your donations, those of you that have donated. One last pitch. If you go to the chat, you'll notice a link in the chat where you can donate. If you're in a position to do so, we would sure appreciate it. And for those of you who did not get your questions answered, please stay tuned for the members only session afterwards, where Dan's going to be more at it here. So again, Dan, thank you so much. Madison, thank you. Krista, and all of you in our audience, thank you very much, and have a great night.